everyone. Welcome to our webinar. I see we've got a strong number of attendees, which is fantastic. So I think we'll go ahead and get started here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are calling in from. Today, we're so pleased to have you. This is our first public webinar for the Zero Emission Maritime Buyers Alliance. I am Ingrid Irigoyen. I'm the Chief Executive of the Zero Emission Maritime Buyers Alliance, or ZEMBA. I'm also the Senior Director for Ocean and Climate at the Aspen Institute. And we will go ahead and get started in a moment with the content. Before we do that, I would like to offer a few logistical notes. One is that we will be recording this session. And so just be aware that if any of your colleagues were not able to attend today and would like to get this content, we will strive to post the recording by the end of this week, so they can then review it afterward. We will also be happy to collect questions from participants throughout the webinar. You can just submit those in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'll collect those as we go. And then we'll open it up for Q&A at the end, and I'll pluck out some questions. Wherever we see that there are themes, we'll try to synthesize those into one question, if you will. And rest assured that if we don't get to all of your questions, which I suspect will be the case, we'll certainly be reviewing all of them. And we may create some public-facing FAQs, depending on what kind of questions they are, whether they need special answering. And then also, of course, feel free to email us at any point in the coming weeks and months. And we're happy to answer your individual questions in that format as well. With regard to answering those one-on-one questions, I just want to note that the US-based ZEMBA staff will be offline next week for the Thanksgiving holiday. So if you do send us emails, you may not get a response until the week after, the first week of December. So just for your awareness. And then the other thing I'll do is, if you wouldn't mind, even though participants can't see each other, if you wouldn't mind just change your name and organization in the Zoom, and you can do that if you, that'll just allow us to be able to see who attended and see who asked which question, so that if we do need to follow up with you one-on-one, we can do that. So with that, let's go ahead and get the slides up. Super. So I'll just review how we plan to spend our time together today. We'll do a little bit of opening and context setting, introduce folks to the project. I know that many of you are probably well aware of what we're doing and what we're trying to achieve, but for those of you who may be new to ZEMBA, I'll provide some of that introductory information. And then we'll really get into the meat of the discussion, which is around the design for our second tender. So that will be, try to keep that to about 20 minutes. We'll summarize the content that was publicly released a couple of weeks ago, and which hopefully you've been able to review online, and talk about specific next steps as well. And particularly we'll be addressing, excuse me, those next steps to prospective bidders and fuel producers. But of course, we'll have a note for any of you who are cargo owners and are curious and interested in potentially joining our exciting work. And then we'll aim to spend 15 minutes answering your questions at the end. Next slide, please. So to be clear about the objectives for this particular session, we really want to help build understanding what is the mission of ZEMBA very specifically. And of course, that is to bring together leading customers of the shipping industry to create a market for long-term economically viable solutions. We'll also dive deeply into the scope, parameters, and requirements of ZEMBA's next tender, which will be focused on e-fuels. And then we'll also go ahead and clarify the timeline and next steps for all of you. And of course, you may have seen already that we plan to launch the next tender in late January. So this is a little bit of a preview. We're doing this so that we can give bidders and fuel producers a little bit of extra time to start preparations before the RFP actually officially launches. Next slide, please. So what is the problem that we're trying to solve? I think you're all probably joining us today because you very much understand the challenges in the maritime space, transitioning to a clean energy based sector is a challenge for a number of reasons, and in particular having to do with the need for a lot of new infrastructure, fuel production facilities, different kinds of bunkering infrastructure, certainly vessels that are able to use the new fuels, and all of that requires significant long-term investment. And we've heard from the sector that it's very difficult for you all to make those kind of investments without guaranteed offtake. And so we are trying to create confidence in off-taker, in the ability of cargo owners and the willingness to off-take for the right solutions, and do that in a way that is very organized and in the context of a coherent strategy, so that we can achieve decarbonization of this sector on the timelines and trajectories that many of our organizations have committed to publicly, and to ensure that we have a smooth and economically viable transition to a clean energy economy globally, of which shipping is, of course, a key backbone. And we all know how important this sector is to the global economy, and that's why it's such an important focus for us today. So let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about specifically what we're trying to achieve right now. So we know that for what we principally need to be focusing on is a fuel and technology switch. And you can see the gray, we call these affectionately our donuts. The gray donut is essentially the current fuel mix. There's a little bit of biodiesel that's being deployed now, but we're really seeing primarily conventional fossil fuels still heavily dominating in the maritime space. And of course, what we need to be shifting toward are a set of fuels that can get us to a zero emission future. And so what you see in the what we call the rainbow donut here is a projected fuel mix. And this is an average across a number of studies. And so I know there's been a lot of debate, and this sector has indulged in a lot of argumentation about what will be the fuel mix of the future. And of course, the reality is that none of us can predict that with accuracy. Predicting the future is a notoriously hard thing to do. But based on some good science, some good modeling, some projections of different potential policy pathways, there does seem to be a general sense that what we need to be shifting toward is a fuel mix that is principally grounded in clean hydrogen-derived fuels. And so that is the future that we want to help drive toward. And of course, what we see today is mostly biofuels in terms of those greener alternatives. And those are good first steps to take, of course, some of which are drop-in fuels, which is, of course, convenient as well. But there are some real scalability concerns that I think everyone acknowledges. And for that, because of those limited feedstocks, we do need to be thinking ahead and deploying new fuels and getting this new market created as quickly as possible. One of the things that ZEMBA is focused on, again, given that we are a group of freight buyers, is catalyzing the adoption of those solutions that can really get to scale and the potential for cost reduction with scale. And that's really important for an economically viable transition. And keeping in mind, of course, that the freight buyers who we work with, they have targets for greenhouse gas reduction in many cases across their supply chain. And they're staring at 2030. They're eager to see how they can achieve their 2040 targets. And then, of course, the whole sector has already committed to being fully decarbonized, essentially, by 2050. So the way that we can get there is via rainbow donut or some similar iteration of it. Next slide, please. So these are some of our member companies. We've got over 40 companies now. We get new members joining every week, which is fantastic. I think a lot of folks are excited about our next tender in particular. This is a subset of those companies, but you can see some of who we have represented here on the slide. And just to be clear on some aspects of the mission that we have come together to build here through this first of its kind Buyers Alliance, we want to accelerate the deployment, the real physical deployment of clean energy shipping solutions. It's our view that we don't need to talk too much more about the challenges. It's really time to just start implementing the solutions. And so we want to also create access to high integrity environmental attributes. And I think this is an important point that I'll continue to make throughout the presentation. For those of you who are newer to ZEMBA, being clear that what we're doing is we're creating access to new solutions, and we're enabling our freight buyers to purchase the emissions reduction, so covering the premium above conventional fuels for the deployment of those new fuel alternatives in return for the ability to claim those emissions reductions as a scope 3 to help meet their scope 3 targets. So that's what our customers are looking to buy. We'll talk more about that in a moment. We also want to enable economies of scale right out of the gate. We know that these alternatives are more expensive than conventional fuels, and it's very hard for any one cargo owner to do this alone. So we want to help boost that scale right away. And that hopefully will accelerate the time frame for starting to see decreases in per unit cost of those solutions. And of course, when freight buyers come together, they can do so much more. They can have a much more meaningful impact, both in terms of emissions reduction and also in terms of stimulating a market for the right kind of solutions. And then the sector also is craving, at least the freight buyers in the sector are craving a lot more transparency about emissions. They want to ensure that these kind of in-sector investments are really getting them the emissions reduction that they're paying for. And so by working together, we can have a much more, I think, robust and fruitful set of data available for our cargo owners to really understand the impact that their investments are having. I'll note that ZEMBA was formed in 2023 with co-founders Amazon, Patagonia, and Chibo. And in fact, we have one of our board members with us today, Mauro Inoka from Amazon. And Mauro, I'd love to give you an opportunity if you want to say a few words to our audience. Oh, and you're muted.
I apologize. Thank you. Thanks, Ingrid. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Mauro Inoka. As Ingrid mentioned, my team and I are leading Amazon's efforts to decarbonize our maritime transportation, an extremely critical component for our logistics network that represents a very significant portion of Amazon's overall emissions footprint. So because of this, we're really tackling the maritime decarb challenge head on, knowing its importance to sustainability goals and the broader impact on global shipping. And frankly, it's so awesome to be in the presence of so many like-minded folks. Thank you for joining us today to explore ZEMBA and the groundbreaking work that the Aspen Institute and their partners are doing. I'd like to extend a special thanks to Ingrid and the Aspen Institute really for their leadership, innovation, collaboration in this crucial initiative since 2023. Their expertise and dedication have been instrumental in getting us to where we are today. And the progress we've made in the past year is nothing short of remarkable. And we at Amazon, I can tell you that we're very confident that ZEMBA represents our most viable path to decarbonizing maritime transportation for Amazon. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to the bidders, fuel producers, and cargo owners joining us today. You are crucial to this initiative. You make it work. Your presence underscores the growing interest in sustainable shipping. And we are very keen to partner with you because we believe that by consolidating demand, we can accelerate decarbonization efforts and truly address the pricing challenges that we've seen so far in this sector. Thanks again for your time. Ingrid, thanks for the opportunity to speak. Let's collaborate to build a more sustainable future for maritime transportation. I truly believe together we can make a significant impact. Thanks, Ingrid.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mauro. And you're joining us early in the morning from the West Coast. I was watching the sunrise behind you. So thank you for your yet another mark of your commitment to the work. So fantastic. Well, let's keep going. We can move on to the next slide. For those of you who aren't aware, we did complete our first tender earlier this year. It was sort of a pilot to see if this process would work. And in fact, it did quite well. And so we were able in April to announce the first ever collective multi-year offtake commitment from freight buyers for near zero greenhouse gas shipping. And so we were able to show that the system works. Of course, there are always a few kinks when you are first trying to get a machine to run. And we had an incredible learning experience working with our companies, working with our bidders, working with fuel producers to complete that first round tender in what I would say was probably record time for such a collaborative endeavor. We had about 17 cargo owner and freight buyer members who ended up signing bilateral contracts. As a result of that work, Hapag-Lloyd was the winner and really was an excellent collaborator and problem solver with us throughout the process. And then we are excited to see deployment of the alternative fuels in 25 and 26 as a result of that first round. We were able to get a more than 90% emissions reduction for our members as a result, and making a meaningful first start in terms of avoiding greenhouse gases. So really pleased with how round one worked. We've learned a lot and look forward to an even smoother, more impactful, and a little bit refined process for our second round. So let's go now into what you all really want to hear about, which is the round two design. And I will say that this is going to be a summary of what we announced last week. And so many of you probably have already had an opportunity to review some of the more detailed materials that we've put online. Those are, again, we offered those several months before the RFP actually goes live so that you would have an opportunity to start to study them, ask us questions, and start to get organized for the submission of bids. And so one of the most important things that you might have taken away from that announcement is that we are really exclusively focusing this next tender on catalyzing the commercial deployment of e-fuels. And so hydrogen-derived, clean hydrogen, electrolytic hydrogen-derived fuels. We are in the process of receiving the volume nominations from our members, and we're able to have at least an at-least number to announce last week. And our intention is to aggregate at least 80 billion ton miles of demand, which is a big number with a strange unit. So I'm going to give you an equivalent. So over the 3 to 5 year commitment that we're offering, seeking deployment in 2027, we're looking for the equivalent of about 1.4 million TEUs if those were being moved across the Pacific. Now, the next tender will be geography neutral. We'll get into those details. So just as an example, we've given the Shanghai LA route, but it would be approximately that many containers decarbonized over the 3 to 5 year period. And again, more volume is coming in, and in fact, we're recruiting more members every day as well. So that number will almost certainly go up between now and January, but at least it gives you a sense of approximately what we're looking for. Next slide. So why are we focused on e-fuels? This is a question that some of you may already instinctively know the answer to, and some may benefit from a little bit of an explanation on why we made this decision. So we're really focused on long-term solutions. We think that that is one of the sort of missing pieces in the current sort of ecosystem that is driving change. And of course, advanced biofuels play an important role. We expect them to play a role in decarbonization of the sector going forward. But it's also widely accepted that the most sustainable waste-based biogenic feedstocks are going to be limited in supply. And so that when you combine that supply limitation with competition from other sectors, it means that we really need to be looking for those vastly scalable solutions that can also come down in cost with scale. And so many of the analyses that we've looked at show that it is really the e-hydrogen derived fuels that need to dominate the mix in 2050 for us to achieve those goals. By de-risking the offtake commitments that carriers will need to make to get access to those fuels and accelerate not just the production, but also the on-the-water deployment of these fuels, we have come together to specifically tender for the environmental attributes of deployment of those kind of fuels. That will help create confidence for carriers, for fuel providers, for policymakers, and enable those costs to come down sooner in time than they otherwise would have if we hadn't been intentional, organized, and strategic about this procurement. So it really is focused on the long-term solutions. We're open to lots of different potential solutions. We try to be as neutral on specific fuel and technology pathways as possible, as sort of a philosophy of the project. But we do have fairly strict criteria in terms of the nature of what it is that we're looking for. And in this particular case, we are focused exclusively on e-fuels and on their deployment in the container segment. Next slide. So this is just to hit that message home. What's in and out of scope for this next RFP. You can see the type of fuels we're talking about. Here are some examples: e-methanol, e-methane, e-ammonia. This is what we are really pursuing. We're also always keeping an eye on alternative technologies like fuel cells that can, of course, there's a nexus there with e-fuels of the future, primary wind propulsion, all kinds of alternatives. There is a lot of discussion now about onboard nuclear. Of course, a lot of those are a little bit further into the future, but we think nonetheless, e-fuels will be tremendously important in the coming decades, and so are confident in being able to focus on that solution set right now. Next slide. So how did we come to this decision? We did a few things. So first of all, of course, we reflected on our inaugural pilot tender and learned some important lessons about how to do this process smoothly. We also did a request for information this summer, and many of you replied. So thank you so much to the many, many dozens of companies that submitted information to the RFI. It was tremendously, tremendously helpful. And what we were able to see from that is that we do have confidence in the near-term market readiness of maritime e-fuels. And we did see from the RFI results some pretty strong confidence that we can seek that deployment to start in 2027 and get some solid bids. So that helped us narrow our focus to e-fuels. And, of course, we want to attract a broad range of qualifying bids, and so haven't been specific about which subset of fuels we're narrowing it down to. We want to see electrolytic hydrogen-derived fuels. And of course, that's for all the long-term reasons I've already described. A lot of the details you'll see in ZEMBA's sustainability framework. I'll show you in a few moments where you can find that on our website. There's a lot of detail there. And again, we've published that a couple of months ahead to ensure that you have plenty of time to prepare bids. We've also revised our threshold requirements for bid submission, and we'll review that in a few moments. And by the way, for folks, just as a quick reminder, if you haven't put your name, if you haven't identified yourself, again, this is no other participants can see you, but we can see you. So as you ask questions, please do just make sure that your name and organization are there, so that if we need to follow up with you one-on-one, we know who asked which question. I promise not to call out your name with the question asking. We can keep those anonymous. That's no problem at all. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about the specifics. And of course, there's a lot more detail in the documents that we provided last week, but I'll review some of the key points here now. So we are looking for bids for service starting in 2027. We would be happy to accept bids if a carrier can launch earlier for 26 or for 28. If someone feels that they can't access the right fuels or they have vessels that won't come online until 28, please go ahead and submit those bids. But 27 is approximately the timeframe that we'll be looking for. And our companies are offering 3 to 5 year commitments. And so those may range a bit. Some companies may commit 3, some may commit 5. You'll have a much more detail about that when we open the RFP and we've actually completed the volume nomination process. But that gives you a general sense. will again be focused on geographic neutrality in terms of deployment. So what that means is that by using a book and claim system, because we're just buying from you the emissions reduction, it means that you can deploy these fuels wherever it is most feasible and economically viable for you to do so. And so the beauty of that is we have sort of decoupled the physical constraints of physical cargo movement, the geography, the time frame, all of that, and that is how we are able to aggregate demand in the way that we're doing. So geography neutral, and of course, in the process of decoupling, it means that what we're paying is the premium, right? It's the premium beyond conventional fuels in return for buying essentially the emissions reduction. So being able to swap out that greener fuel deployment in our members' greenhouse gas inventories. And we will be using a book and claim registry for the tracking of the emissions reduction claims. That will be the book and claim registry of our choice. We are working with the Catalyst project that is run by the Maritime McKinney-Muller Center and RMI, with close collaboration from our cargo owners and the Center for Green Market Activation. And so just note that that's a project that we're all working collaboratively to build that first nonprofit book and claim registry. In terms of bidder eligibility, this is an important one, and we got a lot of questions in our first round about this. So the bidders must be ocean carriers in the container ship segment, at least for this tender. As many of you know, we have contemplated over time opening up this process to other segments of shipping and are still very keen to do that. For now, our members still primarily use container shipping, and we heard from them that their preference would be for this next round to continue to focus on container. And that is, of course, because our freight buyers want to get as close to that impact as they can. But we know that we've also heard interest from both cargo owners and operators in other segments as well. And so that's something that we're going to continue to work on. And in fact, we've chosen the tender unit for this round in part because we want to look ahead to that multi-segment potential future. So for those of you in other segments of shipping, hold tight. We promise we still have you very much at front of mind. For this next tender, we just like to keep only so many variables in flux, if you will, at any given moment. So we are open to individual carriers' bids, of course. If carriers want to form a consortium and have that entity submit a bid, that would also be acceptable. And then, of course, if there are proposals that have subcontractors, if a regional feeder carrier is helping to deploy some of those fuels and move boxes for a global carrier, that's one example of the way that you could have a prime and a sub. But we would want one primary bidder. So that's really important for us, is to have one point of contact and one counterparty for the eventual contracts. One change from the first round is that we are open to the potential for multiple winners. We'd be particularly interested if we had multiple different fuel pathways to be able to explore supporting a couple of different fuel types. Perhaps we could explore deployment in a couple of different geographies. So we'll have to see what we get in terms of the diversity of bids. And of course, how they sort of stack up against both the technical criteria and then how competitive the pricing is. But we would love to be able to have a multi-winner outcome. We think that would be helpful. And we know that on the supplier side, that's something that many of you have wanted us to do. And then finally, we will continue to have our ZEMBA members. They will bilaterally contract with the winning carrier or carriers. But we will, again, provide a pre-negotiated template contract, and we'll provide that template when we launch the RFP in January. So carriers will have that earlier. And then we'll over the course of bid negotiation, we would potentially make some tweaks. We'd be open to a few changes, although we feel very confident in the template that we've come up with. It seems to work, and it's been refined from what some of you may have seen in the first round. Being abundantly clear with you all that we are not contracting for physical freight movement. So we are contracting for the emissions reduction, so the environmental attributes of the fuel switch. And so what we're offering to pay essentially is the premium. It's the cost gap between the conventional fossil powered service and if you were to switch to an alternative e-fuel powered service. So that's something that I know some suppliers are not yet familiar with how that works. And of course, we're happy to take questions about that. But also, you know, in the context of bid evaluation, we can have a lot of robust discussion about how that actually works. And then this one is a change from the first round. So our proposed tender unit is price per ton nautical mile. And we know that in the container segment, you mostly think in terms of TEUs. There are some simple conversion factors like that have been offered by a number of the bodies listed on the slide, where we can assume that a TEU is about 10 tons. So there is some simplification that can be found there with a simply add a zero. But figuring out exactly how we're going to deploy this is something that we're actually really interested in hearing from some carriers about, and may reach out to some of you with a few questions on operationalizing that tender unit. But one of the reasons that we're really moving in this direction is not only to prepare for that multi-segment future, where in other segments, tons are actually the most logical unit, but also because the cargo owner facing guidance that they are getting from Science-Based Targets Initiative, Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the GLEC framework, ISO standard, all of those require a ton nautical mile unit. So we want to make sure that we're making this not just easy for suppliers, of course, we want you to bid, and this needs to work for you as a business opportunity. We also need to make it as easy as possible for our members to then report those emissions reductions to the various bodies and according to those various standards. So some of the nuances and details of how we'll do that are things that we're still working through, and we have a few more weeks before the tender launches, but eager to hear any thoughts or reactions, and feel free to send those our way. Next slide, please. Okay, fuel requirements. So this is important nuance here. So we are requiring e-fuel deployment for primary propulsion, so main engine. And that needs to achieve at least a 90% reduction on a well-to-wake basis. We also encourage the use of low emission fuels for auxiliary power and pilot fuel, but those are not requirements to have a bid be accepted for evaluation. Note that in the case of pilot fuel, we are capping that at sea at 20% for ammonia and 10% for other fuels. And there are some reasons behind this decision. Primarily, our main objective is to get as much e-fuel deployed as possible. And we know that for a number of carriers, you've been investing in retrofit vessels, and they don't necessarily all have the capacity to use the e-fuels for auxiliary power. So we want to make sure that we're getting allowing for as many bids as possible. And so therefore requiring that e-fuel deployment primarily for primary propulsion. But of course, we would encourage you to use any low carbon fuels for the full power plant so that we can get the biggest per voyage emissions reduction possible, balancing that, of course, with cost. And then just to be clear what we mean by e-fuels, again, just reiterating, we're talking about fuels produced with hydrogen made through electrolysis with additional clean energy. And for those fuels that require carbon, which several of them do, we would be looking for a certified waste-based source of carbon. The waste feedstock classifications, as last time, would be aligned with the CORSIA classification framework. And then we also have some hydrogen safeguards and requirements related to time matching, market boundary, and incrementality. Rest assured, we have looked carefully at what the EU requires, what some of the US tax credits are requiring, and tried to find a middle ground that perhaps is a little bit easier to meet than some of those regulatory requirements, but still is very much in the spirit of ensuring that the renewable energy is above and beyond what otherwise would have existed. We also will be looking for, of course, independent third-party verification And again, as per the first round, the standard holder needs to be recognized by the European Commission. And so that we're looking at RSV and ISCC, and as previously, ISCC is probably the most likely, given some of our other requirements. Also, just one quick note on e-methane. Any e-methane bids, we will be asking you to provide us with both pricing and emissions associated with two different delivery pathways. One is segregation and transportation of that e-methane for direct bunkering onto a vessel, which we know adds cost and emissions, transport emissions. But we want to see what that looks like, and then also give us the pricing and the emissions for a pipeline mass balance approach. So we'd like to be able to evaluate the pros and cons of those for any e-methane bids. And then we urge everyone to please take a careful look at our additionality statement. It's very specifically aimed for our next tender and our deployment and sort of the philosophy that we're going into this with. And fundamentally, the spirit here is that our freight buyers don't want to voluntarily pay for their suppliers' regulatory compliance obligations that they would need to be meeting anyway, right? So the costs of those regulatory compliance obligations should be spread across your customer base, not just picked up by the brave and the few. So our members are making a voluntary commitment above and beyond what is required by regulation. That's a very important document that we hope that you will study carefully. Next slide. And of course, that applies to fuel producers as well, because that's a critical component. Next slide. So threshold requirements. So what will we be looking for? We're certainly looking for bidders who have demonstrated financial stability, that have good business practices. If there's been any scandals in your recent past, please do disclose those. It doesn't mean that you'll be out. We just want to understand if there was litigation or some significant breach of environmental rules. It's good to keep that in mind. We also want to make sure that our bidders are meeting some of the highest sort of social responsibility requirements. And so looking to bodies like the UN Global Compact, and you'll see more rules on that in the specific details. For fuel suppliers, we do want all bidders to name your fuel supplier. That's one of the reasons we're giving you a few months advance notice, is that we hope that that means that you've already started some conversations between fuel producers and carriers who might want to partner up on a bid. So we do want you to name your fuel producer right up front, and to just know that we're going to want to talk to them. So we need your upfront permission to be able to ask them questions directly. And that's not in any sort of desire to do an end run around our carrier bidders at all. It's just that we often find the fuel producer can answer questions about things like feedstock and production methodology much more specifically than if we have to do this game of telephone. So just know that we will want to talk to the fuel producer, but we will certainly limit that conversation to the technicalities, and we won't talk about pricing. But just know that that's something that we will be requiring. We also, of course, want the fuel producers to be good and responsible companies that haven't done any terribly bad deeds lately. And then, in terms of, production capacity is something that we'll also, of course, want to make sure that the fuel producer or fuel producers, right? So a carrier may actually have multiple fuel providers, and that just make sure that what they're proposing in terms of production is actually feasible and realistic in light of the volume that we are seeking. And that, of course, is particularly important when we're talking about entirely new fuels, where we may be among the first off-takers of some of those fuels. So we want to make sure that that production capacity is sufficient, or predicted to be sufficient, as much confidence as we can have. And then, of course, eligibility requirements need to be met, as I've described. And then, of course, we'll need bidders to agree to our contract structure. Generally speaking, again, we've got a template. Because the contracting is bilateral, and we've had the experience of some tweaking between the winner and each individual cargo owner, but there are some sort of core components of the deal that, of course, we'll want to hold firm on. And then the last thing is just because we're talking about brand new fuels, we would want to see bidders have a bit of a contingency plan. Like if my primary fuel producer, if something falls through, I've already explored some backup options that would help give us confidence in eventual delivery. And then, of course, proof of vessel availability, just one last thing, but you've got to have a ship. You've got to have it on the water. You've got to have it on order. We need to have some confidence that the vessel that can use those fuels will, in fact, be available in that time frame. So we may ask for some evidence of that as well. Slide, please. Great. So just this is another area where we have found there's can sometimes be some confusion. And that is around what are the different roles and responsibilities of different partners, because e-fuel producers are, of course, tremendously important in this mix. But e-fuel producers are not the bidders, right? So the bidders need to be ocean carriers, and they need to be operating in the container segment. We know that some regional feeder carriers are really on the front foot on this transition, and that's fantastic. So we do welcome them to submit bids directly. They are eligible to bid. We'd also love to see some global carriers partnering with some regional feeders in some of those instances. That kind of collaboration is always warmly received. And then, of course, you need to be showing that you can operate e-fuel capable vessels. Your role is to really start assembling those bids. It is the carrier that submits the bid and is our primary point of contact throughout bid review. We would strongly encourage the interaction and coordination with other actors in the value chain. So thinking about permitting bodies, ports, bunkering, all kinds of value chain actors may need to be part of this conversation with you. And, knowing that there is that kind of collaboration and planning proactively happening would be a big confidence booster for us as we review those bids. So please do keep that in mind as well. We're trying to avoid there being any strange hiccups, a couple of years down the road. So want to know that those interactions are already starting. And of course, one format for that kind of interaction can be green corridor initiatives, of which there are many dozens now active. That's one way that this kind of cross value chain interaction can happen quite efficiently. And then, of course, we encourage you to reach out to e-fuel bidder producers now. Let's get these conversations started early. And it will ultimately be the carrier that does the bilateral contracting with our members. For e-fuel producers, you won't be submitting bids directly. It's fine if you're part of multiple bids. We may have one fuel producer appearing in multiple bids. That would be totally acceptable to us. You wouldn't be considered part of the consortium. So when we use that word, we're really talking about consortia of carriers. But again, e-fuel producers would need to be named, and we will want to talk to you. We encourage e-fuel producers review the requirements now. Let us know if you have questions, and then just be prepared for us to reach out to you if you're among the bids that are moving forward in the process. We'll want to have a relationship as well. Next slide. So we've created a number of resources in our sustainability framework for you to take a look at. So it's the eligible fuel requirements. There's a pretty detailed and lengthy document for that, as well as the emissions intensity calculation requirements. This is what we used to call our LCA guidelines, but this is we've been taught that this is a more accurate way to describe it. And then, of course, that additionality statement that I've urged you to take a look at. You can see, as you may be aware, we launched a brand new, beautiful website last week, and you can find all of those materials. Just go to our homepage and you will find it, and there's the more detailed URL down there at the bottom. So now we are going to talk a little bit about timeline and upcoming next steps. So, right now, we are in a period of time where you've got some of the really important foundational documents from us. You're still waiting for some details, though. And rest assured, you will get all those details when we launch the RFP in January. And we'll also strive to answer as many questions as we can between now and that period of time. And by the way, that also includes if you see a challenge with the way that we plan to proceed. We're very in a spirit of humility and mutual learning. We really do want to hear input from everybody in this ecosystem about what you think will work, what won't work, what could be a challenge. Have we thought about X or Y? So just know that we're really quite open in that way. Doesn't mean that we can respond to every question immediately or necessarily have all the answers right away, but just rest assured that we're very committed to to reviewing that input and those questions. So that's the period of time we're in right now. And we would love to hear from carriers who are interested in potentially submitting a bid. And the way that you can really express that interest is to go ahead and get an NDA signed with us. Some of you already have NDA signed with us from previous rounds. We have just one little addendum to that existing agreement that is a very simple fix that we think that you will like. And so please do get in touch and we can just get that little addendum made. For those of you who are not yet under NDA with us, that's something we strongly, strongly encourage you to go ahead and reach out now, and let's go ahead and get that done, because that means that when we launch the RFP in January, we can send you all of the materials. We also use a technology platform that's a sophisticated platform that ensures things like confidentiality, and otherwise we'll make sure that you get logged into that system ahead of time so that you receive all of the materials that you need to actually build your bid right as soon as we launch that. So please go ahead, let's do that homework ahead of time. And then just note that we will be out. So the other thing that we've learned is that maritime decarbonization never stops. And so we will be having a close, in addition to next week, where most of us will be signing off for the Thanksgiving holiday here in the United States. Also over the around the new year, we will have a closed period between December 23rd and January 3rd. So you just won't hear from us. That's all. We'll answer any questions when we come back, but just don't expect a response until the 4th or later. And then at the end of January, approximately, and we'll try to be clear on exactly what date, but it depends. There are some things happening in the world that may cause us to shift the exact announcement by a few days. So we'll certainly be nailing down that date shortly. And at that point, you would receive the bid sheet and all of the additional materials that you might need. We'll develop a bidder question and response catalog, so always striving to have our bidders receive all of the same information. And so when questions come in, we'll anonymize those, we'll compile them with answers and make sure that everyone can have the opportunity to get the full information. And then we'll do some clarification calls. We may have some questions for you, and you may have some questions for us. So we're offering an additional touch point. Last time our timing was a little tricky with the holidays and otherwise, and we really kind of weren't able to do as much back and forth interaction as we would have liked. We've really planned for that this time. And so plan to have those touch points with you. And then a formal expression of intent to bid will be requested around the middle of February. And that's how that gives us a sense of, all right, who are we expecting and what kind of bids are we expecting to get in? That'll help us be more efficient and organized as we prepare for bid review. And then they'll be due sometime around the end of March. And of course, we'll be much more specific about these dates in the future, but this gives you a rough sense. And then we'll take a couple of months after that to really carefully evaluate those bids. We'll select a short list, and we'll just have a lot more detailed dialogue at that point once we have some shortlisted bidders. And then we will select a winner. And we're thinking probably about mid-June. Of course, some of that may shift. We may be able to do things a little faster, a little slower, depending on the circumstances. But that's what we're aiming for. And then our cargo owners would essentially take the summer to work with that notified bidder to actually enter into contracts. And so their confirmation of the volume. So keeping in mind, remember this, the nomination of volume that we tender for is an estimate based on some cost modeling that we've done, based on publicly available information to just give a sense. It is at the volume confirmation stage, which will be next summer. That's where our cargo owners will see all of the commercial details from the winning bidders and decide on how much volume they would like to commit over how many years to which carrier. And so that process will happen over the course of the summer. And then we'd like to have a really great celebration for the winner or winners in the fall, and potentially we could throw a great party. So let's think about what kind of events would be good for that kind of announcement. We announced the winner of our first tender at Singapore Maritime Week earlier this year, which was a great forum for that kind of announcement. So we'll be looking for something that's sort of similarly fabulous and helps get the word out about this great deal that we have been able to enter into. So making sure we keep enough time for questions here, which it looks like we will have plenty of time, which is great. So let's go to the next slide and just show you, this is our new website. If you go, those of you who've been tracking us for a while, we still have the old COSEB website up just as a record. We're going to shift some of those materials to other websites, but that's really a bit of an archive at this point. This is really the website you want to be going to for ZEMBA specific information. That old COSEB website also will redirect you to the ZEMBA website, so don't worry if you get lost, just you'll find your way here. But this is where you can find all of the detailed information, FAQs that we'll certainly be adding to as the months unfold and your questions come in. We'll realize that there are some things we need to clarify for everyone. This is also where you'll find our announcements and a lot of other good information. And as we add members, you'll also see all of their logos there. Well, not all of them, those who have given us permission to put their logo. So next steps for all of you are, if you've got any clarifying questions, particularly related to bid preparation, please send them to, we've got this special email address just for bid related questions, rfp@shipzemba.org. Prospective bidders, again, those are ocean carriers. Please review the sustainability framework. Reach out to us if you're interested in participating to get that NDA initiated and make sure that we all hit the ground running in January when the RFP goes live. And then please also be reaching out to prospective fuel producers. Show them the eligible fuels requirements, see if they can meet it, and then start your partnerships with them. E-fuel producers, conversely, reach out to carriers, explain to them how your fuel meets our eligibility requirements, how much volume, and then of course it's up to you all to get into pricing. And really we want to see nice collaborations across the value chain. That's part of the spirit of all of this, is that if we work together, we can really help address this challenge in a way that will be both a business opportunity and have us all feel that we're doing the right thing by our planet and the many people who depend on it, all of them, in fact. And then for cargo owners and freight buyers, it's certainly not too late to join for this next round tender. We would love to see a few more freight buyers cross the finish line. We know we have a lot in the pipeline. The best time to join would be right now so that we can get your volume nomination into the mix for this next tender. And of course, for prospective members who are still unsure and, the sands around us are constantly shifting and not sure if they want to be publicly named, just know that we do have some members who are choosing not to name themselves as members publicly. And that's fine. Of course, we love to be able to name our members because they're wonderful companies and we want to be able to celebrate them, but we're also happy to have quiet members. What really matters here is the impact that we have in the market. So we're going to open it up for questions, and I have not put up my usual antitrust rules because you will not be talking to each other. So we'll just be fielding these questions through the Q&A function, and I'm looking over here at my compendium of questions, and there are some good ones here. And so I appreciate my colleagues have been organizing these behind the scenes. And just give me 1 second and I will review the first question. And actually, first, let me note that I've got a couple of colleagues here who are important members of our technical team who might help answer some of these questions. So Charlie McKinley with the Lloyd's Register Maritime Decarbonization Hub is on the line, as is Edmund Yee from the Center for Green Market Activation. They help us with a lot of the technical aspects of the fuels and the book and claim systems and the carbon accounting. So they're available to help answer some of these questions as my weaknesses come to the fore. All right. Here's a question. Would you consider engaging earlier than 2027 if carriers have the availability of e-fuels that they can offer from mid 25 onwards? Oh, yes, we would love to see some bids for earlier deployment. What we've been asking our members to nominate volume for starts in 27. But if we see some bids that could start earlier, we're happy to go back to our members and see if some of them would like to actually accelerate their commitment. And so happy to receive those kind of bids. Absolutely. Great. Here's a question about book and claim registries. Yeah, so this is a good question. So we have been working closely with the Catalyst Registry, as I mentioned. That's the first nonprofit maritime registry. It's got a lot of the necessary functionality that we're looking for. We'll continue to work with them for deployment of RFP2 in preparation for that. But if necessary, we're open to different partnerships with different registries if it becomes necessary. So just for awareness, that's sort of our general posture. In case carriers don't have enough fuels, can they fill the gap with biofuel? So good question. All right. So if carriers don't have enough e-fuel to meet our volume requirement, can we fill the gap with biofuel? So this is really an interesting question. So this gets down to the primary propulsion versus auxiliary and pilot fuel. And so the total volume, right? So this is tons of freight moved over a distance. And because of our primary propulsion requirement, the quantity of fuel, there's going to be some interesting calculations that each bidder will have to do on whether that then is whether they can access enough fuel for the primary propulsion of that volume of freight movement over that period of time. For primary propulsion, we're requiring e-fuel. So biofuel can be used for auxiliary, could be used for pilot. But we really are focused on e-fuel for this next tender for the primary propulsion. So we have decided that that's a requirement. But of course, in a multi-winner scenario, if you would like to submit a bid with whatever the maximum you can deliver is, please do, because we may actually need to patch together multiple winners in order to meet the volume. So that should not stop you. Just remember that the primary propulsion needs to be E. How will we evaluate bids? Aha, yes. So we are a very well detailed, thought out bid evaluation process. We've got those minimum threshold requirements that you can see in our materials. And then we'll, really be looking at evaluating the bids holistically. And it's about meeting not just our minimum requirements, but also are some bidders able to go beyond? Are they able to get us a higher emissions reduction because the full power plant has been decarbonized? And then how does that affect the cost, of course? And so always looking at the quality of the decarbonization solution and then relative to the price. And that's not necessarily simple to do. There may need to be some trade-offs, but I would just encourage everyone who thinks that they can submit an eligible bid to please do so. And keep in mind that we are balancing that cost with that full per voyage emissions reduction. And we know that for some retrofit vessels, the e-fuel deployment will really have to be limited to the primary propulsion. If it's possible to also then have lower carbon fuels as for the other fuel needs on such voyages, then that would of course be very welcome and encouraged. But we'll be, I think hopefully the timeline helped explain, and our criteria we hope those help clarify what we're looking for, at least from a technical point of view. But we also, there's some somewhat more sort of subjective components of any such decision. And they include things like, do we feel that the supplier is, being collaborative and reliable and responsive and transparent? Do they share our long-term vision for the future? Are they, a credible partner? And do we have confidence in their ability to deliver? And so some of those are sort of typical aspects of who you might want to engage as a new business partner. And so hopefully not too much of a surprise. Let's see. let's see. We've got here a question. Several carriers are going down an LNG pathway. Can we expand our views on LNG? And is it limiting the number of carriers or alliances eligible to tender for the ZEMBA business? So great question. So yes, LNG, of course, is again at the forefront of lots of discussions. We're seeing a lot of new build orders. Here's what I would say. Fossil LNG is not something that we view as a credible emissions reduction strategy in the long run. And that's because of the well to wake emissions reduction being actually quite limited. Now, on a tank to wake, that's different, but we are always focused on well to wake impact. So not really in scope for us is the bottom line. Of course, our first tender resulted in a waste-based biomethane deal, which we were pleased with. It's a more scalable biofuel than biodiesel, has some advantages, and can be used in the LNG fleet. And there's plenty of livestock waste and landfill gas that is just going into the atmosphere right now. We would rather that be captured and used on ships or in power plants or other to meet other energy needs. In the long run, we think that it's the other energy needs that will probably dominate the offtake for that fuel. So for the LNG fleet, looking at things like e-methane, right? And there are some e-methane producers that will probably be reaching out to you to make those offers. And then, of course, looking ahead to retrofitting for ammonia potentially. So those are the pathways that we see. Generally speaking, we are not encouraging more fossil LNG build out in the maritime space. We really want to see that part of the fleet be planning ahead to the future. I don't think any of us should be able to sleep at night if we're investing in stranded assets and just not being part of the solution. So something to keep in mind. E-methane, let's see, okay, bodies have not, yes, okay, bodies like SBTI and GHGP have not yet aligned on their views, the acceptability of mass balance, book and claim, and the claiming of environmental attribute certificates. How are we dealing with those challenges? Do we have updates on the timing of when clarification will be forthcoming? Yes, so I will take a shot at that. Edmund, you may also want to chime in. I welcome you to do that. Let me take a first run at it. So we are all eagerly awaiting that guidance. I think that we received a pretty strong signal from SBTI in recent months that this is the direction in which they're heading. They are in a bit of a big project right now in trying to evaluate what kind of guidance specifically, because it's complicated. Carbon accounting is as much an art as it is a science, and it's not a simple piece of guidance, and there are a lot of really strong opinions. So we have a lot of empathy, I think, for the folks who are trying to write those rules. But it is our expectation that these approaches will be accepted, and it is our intention to be the best-in-class model that can be followed across a variety of sectors. And I know that I share that sentiment with our colleagues at the Center for Green Market Activation that are doing a number of really important projects in this space. One of them is the Sustainable Aviation, the ZEMBA Buyers Alliance that has a registry for SAF and is about a year or so ahead of ZEMBA in terms of preparing now for its third procurement. And so that is a really important body that we're always looking to for lessons learned and collaboration and ways of being more efficient. The GMA also runs something called the AIM platform, where we are observers, but also is developing some of those guidelines, and with collaboration with all of those sort of standard bodies that need to be involved. And so we're really hoping that this project helps provide some of the clarity that those bodies need, and kind of watch us do our work and see how incredibly robust and rigorous and important this work is. Without those kind of mechanisms that allow for that flexibility, it is going to be virtually impossible to decarbonize sectors like this. We really need the answer to be yes, and I think a lot of the key leaders understand that. The question is very specifically, what will that guidance look like? And so we are always striving to be the best that one can possibly be, so that we are confident that all of those credits will be able to count when the guidance is finally finalized. We were hoping to see draft guidance by the end of this year, but my sense, I believe, is that the timeline may be pushed out a little bit on that. But I would welcome Edmund or anyone else if they want to chime in and correct me or add anything. I'm more than happy to be quiet for a second.
No, I think you're correct in everything you said, Ingrid. My understanding is that guidance has been pushed out till early next year.
Yeah. So unfortunately, we need to wait a little bit longer, but my confidence is as strong as ever that we will reach the right outcome at the end. Certifications that we're requiring. Do we require a pre-certification study to be carried out by an independent certification body, for example, ISCC, as part of the bid, or is a commitment by the fuel producer carrier sufficient at this stage? This may be another one, Edmund, where you might want to chime in, but the general sense is that, in some cases, is part of the bid, you may not actually have that certification completely in hand yet, and the expectation is that you will by the time deployment happens. But Edmund, do you want to chime in on that point? Add a little.
Yeah. Thanks, Ingrid. So just to reiterate the certification requirements for the people that don't have that context. So for the fuel that's deployed for the purposes of the ZEMBA tender, the requirement is that the fuel holds an active RSB, ISCC, or other standard holder recognized by the European Commission, one of those certifications across the full value chain to demonstrate the carbon intensity on a well-to-wake basis. By the nature of these certifications, it's kind of clear that you can't have that certification until the fuel is being fully produced and being produced on a commercial level. And so we don't expect the certification to exist at the time of bidding, like Ingrid said, but we do expect it to exist at the time of deployment. To answer the pre-certification study question that you mentioned, it's not an explicit requirement of submitting a bid or having a bid be eligible to move forward in the evaluation process, but it will be looked at very favorably for the purposes of demonstrating kind of the veracity of your bid information and the sustainability qualities that you claim for the fuel that you're planning to use.
Thank you. Brilliant. So we've got a few more questions here. Will we release information about interested carriers throughout the process? Is ZEMBA intending to play matchmaker between e-fuel providers and carriers? No. So we take our NDAs very seriously. So we absolutely will not. So we don't reveal any information about who has reached out to us with what questions, who's interested in bidding, who has bid. None of that information will be released. Of course, if you want to talk about your enthusiasm for ZEMBA's work in a public setting, of course, you're welcome to do that. But we are pretty strict about the NDA requirement, and that's, of course, to protect proprietary business information and allow for us to sort of communicate openly with one another. We also don't reveal to anyone except for the winning bid or bidders, those who want to confirm volume with a carrier. We don't reveal how much volume our members have put into the process. That's another really important principle that we commit to. So if you are a winner and our members want to buy from you, then of course you'll learn who they are and how much volume they've committed. But that is also something that should not be revealed unless it's done after the fact and in collaboration, of course, with those cargo owners. And so happy, toward the end of the process to be clear on what we can say publicly and what we can't. But we do, try to keep all information that should be confidential, and are very much committed to that. So we've got just a few more minutes left and a few more questions. We may actually get through a few more. Let me see. We've got a question. Can we clarify what we're tendering for throughout this process? Yeah, so it's the environmental attributes of the alternative way of shipping, if you will. So just to try and use sort of non-jargony language. So what a bidder is doing is they're telling us we'd like to use an alternative fuel, an e-fuel, on this vessel on this route. And that will result in the following emissions reduction. Our members then basically buy the emissions reduction from you. They're not physically moving freight with you necessarily. Now they might be, and this may be helpful to your reputation as a green supplier, it may result in more volume or specific physical volume offtake, but that's not the point of the project, right? The point is for cargo owners to be able to invest in the best emissions reduction solutions that we can find in the market today, and those long-term solutions again, and be able to make that investment regardless of where they're moving freight and with which carriers. So if you do have an existing relationship with our cargo owner and you want to take that volume for that e-fuel deployment and somehow attach that to an existing freight contract or relationship, that's something that we certainly allow for. But really specifically what we're looking for is, what is the premium you would charge, that green premium, and how much emissions reduction can they get as a result? So hopefully that's clarifying, and of course happy to answer any other questions along those lines. Where should e-fuel providers go to learn more about ZEMBA's requirements? Please go to our website. So we did a notice of intent to RFP last week. You go to our website, you can see all of those requirements, and we're happy to field any further detailed questions about that. Just send us an email. Can we post this presentation along with the recording? Absolutely, we will do that. We are going to post this. We're aiming for by the end of the week. And then just to remind folks that we will be offline next week. For the most part, some of our European colleagues may still send you a few emails, but for the most part, don't expect to get much of a response from the US-based team. And then how do you get in touch? Yeah, so send us an email, rfp@shipzemba.org. You can also, there's the QR. Oh, no, the slide is down, never mind. But we can drop that into the chat again, and you can just Google us, Zero Emission Maritime Buyers Alliance. It'll go right to our website. And you can find lots of different ways of reaching out to us. And with that, I think we are basically at time. I am always committed to getting people off on schedule. So thank you. I think there are a few questions we didn't quite get to, but if you've told us who you are, we'll do our best to follow up. And for those where we see some common themes in the questions, we'll probably, if they're not already answered in our FAQs, we'll probably do that over the course of the next few weeks. And of course, don't hesitate to reach out and just send us a message. We've got a big team of very smart people who will be happy to help answer those questions and get everyone organized. We hope that you all are feeling as excited about the second round as we are. This is really history-making stuff. This is the change that we need to see, right? This is the full value chain coming together collaboratively to think differently about how we procure fuels, how we deploy them, how we measure our impact, how we can come together to make the business case for suppliers to take the next step forward, how we can build confidence for investors, and of course, very importantly, how we can build confidence for policymakers to see this is a really tremendous economic opportunity. And the job creators around the world really want to see these scalable solutions come to the market and be supported and have an even playing field. So I would leave you with those sentiments. Thank you all so much for being here. Really, really appreciate all of the enthusiasm that we've gotten even since our announcement last week. Just a lot of really great engagement. We appreciate all of the leadership that all of you show in this space. And onward and upward. And with that, we will adjourn. Thank you.